right. Hello, everyone. So what I want to look at in this video is a few structures related to our skull. Let me unselect these. Okay, so a few structures related to our skull. And particularly what I want to focus on is the inside of the skull. And what I want to look at is something called our dural venous system and these things called dural venous sinuses. Okay. So just for orientation, obviously we're looking at the skull here, so we can see frontal bone, and I've kind of faded these bones out so you can see inside the skull. So frontal bone, I've removed the right parietal bone, you can see temporal bone here. If we rotate this around, we can see occipital bone back here, and then we can see parietal bone on the left here along with temporal. Okay, so there's temporal highlighted right there. So what you can see through the skull, or hopefully you can see through the skull, are all of these veins. Okay, all of these veins existing inside the cranial cavity. And you can also see this large kind of whitish gray structure right here. And if I tilt this down, you can also see another one right here that's highlighted in blue. Okay, so what these are something called dural folds, or sometimes you'll see them called dural partitions. Okay, so recall your meninges. You have your dura mater, your arachnoid mater, and your pia mater. The dura being the most superficial, right, the most external around the brain, around the spinal cord. In the cranial cavity, what you have are essentially double folds of dura, and then in certain areas, these dural folds separate, okay, and they create this little opening. Okay, so if we take these words, dural venous sinus, so dural meaning dura, venous referring to veins, so oxygen poor blood, and then the sinus comes from the fact that we've got these two folds of dura, right, and then they separate and they create this opening, okay, or this sinus, which is essentially functioning as a vein. Okay, so my goal here is to show you these kind of dural folds, these dural structures, these dural partitions, along with the relevant bony anatomy, and then actually look at the dural sinuses themselves, right, our dural venous sinuses. So first off, we've already mentioned a few of these, or we've alluded to them, are these folds here. So you can see one right here highlighted in blue, and then you can see another one right here. Okay, so these are called the tentorium cerebelli. You can see this one right here, tentorium cerebelli. This is essentially sitting between the occipital lobes of the brain and the cerebellum underneath. Okay, so it's separating the cerebrum from the cerebellum. And then you have your falx cerebri, or falx cerebri, which is essentially dividing the left and right hemispheres of the brain. Now there's another one, or there's a few others. One other one that I want to mention is called the falx cerebelli. So this is the falx cerebri. There's also the falx cerebelli, and this is dividing the two hemispheres of the cerebellum, right? So our cerebellar hemispheres instead of our cerebral hemispheres. Now, there are certain points where these dural folds, so again, falx cerebri and tentorium cerebelli and others, where they kind of they separate and they open up and they create these sinuses. Okay, so before we get to those sinuses, a few more things related to the to these partitions. Some of the bony landmarks. So tentorium cerebelli that we see, falx cerebri that we see here. This is anchored anteriorly to the crista galli, if you recall, part of the ethmoid bone, and then the internal occipital protuberance back here on the occipital bone, right? So if I remove these, we'll just go ahead and get rid of this one here, and we'll get rid of our tentorium, and you can see the crista galli pretty easily right here, right? This is our crista galli, so part of our ethmoid bone. So again, this whole thing is our ethmoid bone. There's your crista galli, and then if we rotate this around, try to rotate this around, right back here, this is our occipital bone, right? And then in this general area here, this is our internal occipital protuberance, right? So you can feel your external occipital protuberance on the back of your head. If you go midline, you should feel a little bump on your skull. That's your external occipital protuberance. You also have an internal, and again, that's kind of serving as a posterior attachment for the falx cerebri. Okay. Now, again, where those folds kind of separate, you end up with something called a dural venous sinus. Okay, so we have several sinuses, and I just want to highlight a few. Okay, so one inferior one, and kind of really deep, and again, these you're not going to be able to see very well if the brain is there. Okay, some you can, some you can't. So this first one is a little bit lower, so it's more inferior, and it's running in the sagittal plane. So this one here is called the inferior sagittal sinus. Okay, inferior sagittal sinus, kind of running in that midline groove in the longitudinal fissure. Okay, if you go just above that, so this is our inferior sagittal sinus. If you go above that, right here, this large one, and you can see this one pretty well on gross dissection. This is called the superior sagittal sinus. Okay, superior sagittal sinus. So this is your inferior down here, and then we have a superior up above. Okay. Now you can also see these other veins draining over to it. Okay, so we have cerebral veins and these anastomotic veins. We're not really going to worry about those. We're going to focus on the large actual venous sinuses. Okay, so we had a few there. So we had an inferior sagittal sinus, and here we have a superior sagittal sinus. Okay, I'm going to rotate this way, and I'm going to remove our occipital bone. Actually, I'm not going to remove our occipital bone. I want to show you some with the occipital bone present, and then I will remove it. Okay. So where we have these inferior, so remember our inferior sagittal sinus, and we have a superior sagittal sinus, we have this lower one right here coming down off of our inferior sagittal sinus. This one, I'll try to click on it right here. This is called our straight sinus. Okay, so this is essentially a continuation of our inferior sagittal sinus that we have here. We have our superior sagittal sinus, and where all of these come together, so inferior sagittal sinus by way of the straight sinus, and then we have this superior sagittal sinus, it's going to come together right here at this little circular region called the confluence of sinuses. Okay, so let me kind of zoom out just for orientation. So again, this is our temporal bone, here's occipital, here's frontal, and then we have parietal removed. So where the superior sagittal, inferior sagittal, and that straight sinus, continuation of the inferior sagittal, where they come together, this is called confluence of sinuses. Right? Now, there's a few other sinuses that drain into this region, and in particular, we have this large one that we see right here, kind of radiating off transversely. This is called the transverse sinus. Okay, so we have one on the left, and we have one on the right. So both of these highlighted here are transverse sinuses. So all in all, what meets or what extends from the confluence of sinuses, we have our superior sagittal sinus, we have the straight sinus, right? Remember that kind of hooks up here with our inferior sagittal sinus, and then we have these transverse sinuses here. Okay. Now, if we removed all of these cerebral vessels, we would see our occipital bone, and we'd see these little grooves in the occipital bone. Okay, so if I highlight the occipital bone here, hopefully you can see some of these little grooves right here. Okay, so I'm going to highlight it again. This purple one, I'm going to highlight it in blue here. This is the occipital, this little groove in the occipital bone for the transverse sinus. Okay, so if we go back and we look here, there's our transverse sinus there. That transverse sinus is sitting in that groove of the occipital bone. Okay. Now, if we continue to follow this transverse sinus out, you'll notice that it kind of dives down, right? So we are following it here from the confluence of sinuses, transverse sinus, and then it kind of dives down here. And so this is called our sigmoid sinus. Okay, and again, I'm not going to show it on the right side, but know that it would also be over here on the right. So this is kind of in close proximity to our temporal bone. Okay, so this is our temporal bone here, highlighted in blue. This is the petrous region that we kind of have, that I'm indicating right here. This is the petrous region. So in this area, we have our sigmoid sinus. So that term sigmoid is essentially meaning something that's kind of curved, bendy, think S-shaped. Okay, so we go from the transverse sinus, and that leads into the sigmoid sinus. Okay, so for this next view, I kind of want to rotate and look at a posterior superior view looking down, and I want to show two more kind of smaller sinuses, right? So these are both named according to their position relative to this petrous region of the temporal bone. Okay, so this is our temporal bone here. This area that I'm kind of circling with my cursor, hopefully you can see this, this is called the petrous region. Petrous or petrous means rock-like, right? So it's this really thick, dense, hard portion of the temporal bone. And so what we see a sinus here, and we see one here below it. Okay, so these are called the superior petrosal sinus. So think petrous, petrosal. So one here, superior, on the superior margin of this petrous region. And then right below it, we have an inferior petrosal sinus. Okay, so these are kind of extending from this region here called the cavernous sinus, kind of all of these in here, specifically this one here. This is the cavernous sinus. We can see an inferior petrosal sinus on the right side as well. Okay, so these are extending from this kind of this group of sinuses around the pituitary gland, right? So our pituitary would be sitting here in the sella turcica, and these petrosal sinuses are moving backwards toward the transverse sinus. So we see transverse sinus here, and toward the sigmoid sinus here. Okay, so again, zooming out for some context, right? Here's our superior sagittal sinus. Here's our inferior, right there. Remember, those are going to come together and meet at our confluence of sinuses here. Radiating out from that, we have our two transverse. The two transverse merge and can essentially continue as the sigmoid sinus. And now we're ready to leave the skull, right? We're ready to leave the inside of the cranium. And so we know that there is a specific blood vessel that's going to drain the inside of the skull, so drain the brain, and this is going to be our internal jugular vein. So hopefully you can kind of see this vein highlighted here. I'm going to zoom out and show you from an anterior view. So here's our internal jugular vein right here. Okay, remember there's also an external. External is draining more superficial structure, skin, muscles of the face and whatnot. Internal, this is draining the inside of the skull right here, right? So you can see one right there on the left side, and of course there would be one on the right side as well. So here you can see sigmoid sinus, and that's going to continue as internal jugular vein going down. Okay, so we can see our two internal jugular veins on the on this anterior view, again looking at them coming down the cervical region, right? So of course our internal jugular veins are going to exit through our jugular foramina, right? Our jugular foramen, kind of between temporal and occipital bones. Exit through the jugular foramen. There's other things that exit through jugular foramen, some other nervous structures. So think like cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11 are going to come through our jugular foramen right here. And after we pass through the jugular foramen, we are the internal jugular vein, and of course these are going to come down, drain into our subclavian veins, right, or kind of meet with our subclavian veins rather. So if I highlight this here, this is subclavian on the left, this is internal jugular on the left, and of course where those meet, this is going to be brachiocephalic. Okay, so you can see the same thing on this other side. So here's subclavian, here is internal jugular, and where they meet, that's going to be brachiocephalic. The brachiocephalic veins, of course, are going to merge and form the superior vena cava. So if I get rid of our manubrium, oops, I accidentally got rid of our Let me get rid of just the manubrium. Let me get rid of just the manubrium here. We can see our brachiocephalic, our superior vena cava right here, and then of course that's going to drain into the right atrium. Okay. So again, this is venous drainage of the brain, right? This is venous drainage of the inside of the skull. Okay. This is not arterial, right? So arterial, think circle of Willis, cerebral arterial circle, supplying oxygenated blood to the skull. This here is the venous drainage. So again, those major sinuses. Again, there are others besides the ones we talked about, but we talked about kind of the majority of them. One other one that I didn't mention is this small one that you see here. This is called the occipital sinus. So if I go ahead and just go ahead and remove our occipital bone, you can see the occipital sinus right here. Right. So we've got superior sagittal sinus, occipital sinus, two transverse sinuses. Here's the straight sinus, and again, those all come together in the confluence of sinuses right here. Okay. Confluence of sinuses go out, transverse sinus, sigmoid, internal jugular vein, all the way down to superior vena cava, back into the heart. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. Hopefully you got something out of this. Again, make sure you go and kind of practice labeling some of these structures, but also think about where they're draining as well. And please reach out if you have any questions.